In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers at Midway. Then it quarantined its own survivors to keep the Army from finding out. This was not an Allied operation. It was one branch of Japan's military hiding a catastrophe from the other. The Japanese Army and Navy ran separate budgets, separate intelligence, even separate atomic programs. And that internal war helped lose the external one. At the heart of Japan's war effort stood 2 bureaucratic giants, each operating from its own command center in Tokyo. The Army's General Staff commanded from Ichigaya, while the Navy's ministry ran its operations out of Kasumigaseki. These headquarters weren't just buildings, they were the nerve centers of rival empires, each with its own chain of command reporting straight to the emperor and bypassing any unified defense council. The 1925 Budget Act had codified this divide, granting the Army and Navy separate appropriations. By 1944, Army budgets had soared past 12 billion yen, while the Navy's reached over 9 billion yen. Every year, the Imperial Diet approved these parallel budgets, cementing the split in law and practice. The rivalry played out in the numbers and on the ground. Each service ran its own procurement offices, research institutes, and even diplomatic channels. Army and Navy foreign affairs sections dispatched their own envoys to Shanghai and Berlin, filing separate reports to the Prime Minister and the imperial household. Intelligence was no exception. The Army's codebreakers at Ichigaya focused on Russian and Chinese signals, while the Navy's cryptanalysis teams in Kasumigaseki targeted Allied naval codes. These units created redundant reports, often on the same targets but rarely shared findings. Cabinet meetings were flooded with conflicting assessments. Army and Navy papers were delivered side by side, with no obligation to reconcile or even consult one another. Historians like Edward Drea have traced this institutional split through original budget tables, intelligence charts, and staff memos. Saburo Ienaga described the effect as 2 nations sharing one economy, a phrase that captures the absurdity of Japan's internal war. The machinery of the state ran in duplicate, with each branch jealously guarding its own resources, information, and authority, even as the country faced enemies on every front. Inside the walls of Ichigaya and Etajima, young cadets were molded not just as officers, but as loyal sons of their own service. Army and Navy academies enforced a culture of separation so strict it reached into private lives. In 1934, the Army issued a directive forbidding officers under 30 from marrying without ministerial approval. The Navy followed with its own ban in 1935. These rules, written into personnel files and reinforced by daily lectures, aimed to keep officers' devotion undivided. Violating the marriage ban could mean demotion or dismissal. Edward Drea describes cadet indoctrination as a process designed to instill absolute loyalty to the service, not the nation as a whole. At Ichigaya, Army cadets studied Bushido and national essence, while across Tokyo Bay, Etajima's curriculum focused on naval spirit and maritime destiny. The 2 academies rarely exchanged instructors or ideas. This culture of rivalry extended into science and technology. When Japan launched atomic research, the Army and Navy refused to collaborate even as Allied bombs fell on their cities. The Army's Ni-Go project, run by Yoshio Nishina at Riken, began in 1941 with the goal of building a cyclotron and enriching uranium. The Navy's F-Go program, led by Bunsaku Arakatsu at Kyoto Imperial University, started a year later, constructing a linear accelerator with its own team and budget. Neither side shared findings or resources. Both purchased scarce materials in secret, driving up costs and duplicating effort. By 1944, the Army and Navy had spent billions of yen on parallel atomic projects, yet neither came close to producing a weapon. Personnel lists, project charters, and technical reports from both Ni-Go and F-Go show zero overlap, proof that even in the face of national crisis, institutional pride outweighed cooperation. The rivalry was not just bureaucratic, it was lived, enforced, and taught from the first day of a cadet's career. By the late 1930s, Japan's military faced a fundamental question: where should the empire expand next? 2 rival doctrines offered starkly different answers. The Army, led by its general staff, and the powerful Kwantung Army in Manchuria argued for Hokushinran, the northern doctrine. Their vision was a march into Siberia, seizing the resource-rich lands of the Soviet Far East. The Navy, centered at Kasumigaseki, championed Nanshin-ron, the Southern Doctrine, aiming to secure oil, rubber, and tin from Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Each doctrine shaped not just strategy, but the very structure of Japan's forces, with the Army building up mechanized divisions along the Manchurian border and the Navy investing in carriers and amphibious assault ships. The split was more than theoretical. In 1939, the Army's Kwantung units launched a major offensive at Nomonhan on the border of Manchukuo and Mongolia. Facing them was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet and Mongolian forces. Over the course of 4 months, the Japanese suffered approximately 17,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Soviet losses were also heavy, but Zhukov's use of massed armor and coordinated air power shattered the Japanese lines. After action reports from the Kwantung Army archives described the defeat as a blow to the Army's northern ambitions, warning that further attacks on the Soviet Union would require massive rearmament and closer ties with Germany, neither of which materialized. The Army's defeat at Nomonhan did not end the rivalry. In 1941, Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe convened a series of imperial conferences to decide Japan's next move. The Army delegation, led by General Hajime Sugiyama, insisted that the Soviet Union remain the main threat. The Navy, under Admiral Osami Nagano, pushed for a southern advance before the United States embargo strangled Japan's oil supply. Cabinet minutes from July to November 1941 reveal a deadlock. The Army refused to redeploy the Kwantung Army, while the Navy refused to risk its fleet in northern waters. The result was paralysis. Japan would keep its army on the Soviet border while planning a naval strike south. This compromise forced Japan into a two-front dilemma with no unified grand strategy, an internal standoff that would haunt every major decision in the coming Pacific War. Operation MY, the code name for the Midway offensive, was crafted behind closed doors in the Navy's Combined Fleet headquarters. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his staff kept the planning circle so tight that not even Army intelligence officers were briefed on the true objective. The Army received only vague notices about fleet movements, while the Navy's Crypt Analysis Unit at Kasumigaseki withheld decrypted Allied signals, treating them as proprietary secrets. When the fleet sailed in late May 1942, the Army's role was limited to providing a handful of occupation troops, unaware of the scale or risk of the operation. The Navy's strict secrecy extended to its own aviators. Pilots were told only their immediate targets, not the broader plan. According to after-action reports archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Army's senior staff learned of the defeat not through official channels, but from intercepted American broadcasts. The outcome was catastrophic. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day, along with more than 300 aircraft and thousands of trained crew. The blow was so severe that the Navy imposed a quarantine at Kure Naval Base, issuing memos forbidding surviving pilots and sailors from contacting families or Army personnel. The purpose was clear: to prevent news of the disaster from reaching the Army General Staff, and to hide the scale of the loss from the rest of the government. Naval historian Jonathan Parshall describes this as a self-inflicted wound. The refusal to share intelligence or planning details meant there was no Army air support, no coordinated response, and no chance to replace the lost carriers. The material consequences were immediate and irreversible. Japan's carrier fleet, the centerpiece of its naval doctrine, could not be rebuilt. Saburo Ienaga later argued that this was not just a military defeat, but the direct result of institutional rivalry, a war within the war that left Japan fatally weakened before its enemies even struck back. Nakajima's factory floor in 1943 buzzed with the sound of duplicate effort. Engineers like Hiroshi Yoshida received 2 sets of blueprints for what was, in essence, the same fighter aircraft, one for the Army's Ki-43, the other for the Navy's Zero. The difference came down to a radiator shape or a bolt placement, yet the duplication cost 10,000 manufacturing hours per run, according to Yoshida's internal memo. Assembly lines at Mitsubishi and Tachikawa mirrored this waste, each branch demanding its own version, its own engine, its own spare parts. Aluminum, already scarce, was split between rival procurement officers who refused to coordinate. Shipping tables from the Ministry of Munitions show Army and Navy transports competing for the same space in shipyards, with merchant hulls left unfinished as steel allocations overlapped. By 1944, Japan's factories could not keep pace with losses at Midway, and every wasted hour on the shop floor meant another empty hangar or grounded squadron. The rivalry was not just costly, it was self-sabotage, measured in lost planes and lost battles. August 1945 brought Japan to the edge of collapse, but the final battle was fought not on foreign soil, but inside the halls of power. With Allied bombs falling and Soviet troops advancing in Manchuria, Prime Minister Tojo and Admiral Yonai faced a deadlock. Cabinet minutes from those days record ministers circling the same arguments, Army and Navy refusing to yield, each clinging to its own vision of survival. In the shadows, a group of Army officers launched the Kyujo incident, a coup attempt aimed at blocking surrender and silencing the Emperor's recorded message. The plot failed, but it exposed the depth of the rift. Historian Saburo Ienaga, reflecting in a lecture in 1998, called this paralysis the true tragedy of Japan's war. He said, "Two nations sharing one economy, destroying themselves from within while the world watched." The last act of the conflict was not unity against an enemy, but a final, bitter struggle between rivals under the same flag. Japan's greatest enemy, as Edward Drea argues, was not always abroad. It was the institutional warfare within. Saburo Ienaga warns that such rivalry can be fatal for any nation's future. Today, military unity remains a lesson unfinished. The cost of divided command is never just historical, it is a living risk.